There is a moment in every great power struggle when the other side does something nobody expected. Not a declaration of war, not a dramatic speech, not the kind of confrontation that fills newspaper front pages. Something quieter. Something calculated. A single economic decision made inside a government building in Ottawa, and suddenly the most powerful leader in the world is forced to react in real time. That moment happened. And the reverberations are still moving through the corridors of Washington. Think about this for a second. The United States and Canada have shared the longest peaceful border in the world for over a century. Two nations tied together by more than $3 trillion in annual trade. Neighbors who have fought alongside each other in two world wars, built NAFTA together, renegotiated it together, and called each other allies so many times that the word had almost lost its weight. And then, in the space of a few months, that relationship cracked open in a way that nobody, not economists, not diplomatic historians, not even the most cynical Washington observers, had fully anticipated. Canada made a move. A deliberate, coordinated, and politically significant move. And Donald Trump reacted. To understand what happened between these two countries, you have to go back further than the headlines. You have to understand the long, quiet accumulation of pressure that preceded the explosion. Because great crises in international relations are never born in a single moment. They are built slowly, brick by brick, in the years before anyone starts paying attention. The economic relationship between the United States and Canada had always been asymmetrical in ways that were uncomfortable to acknowledge openly. Canada sends approximately 75% of its exports to the United States. That number is not just significant, it is defining. It means that Canadian manufacturers, farmers, energy companies, and technology firms are deeply, structurally dependent on American market access in a way that the United States simply is not dependent on Canada. When trade tensions arise, that asymmetry matters enormously. It creates leverage. And leverage, in the hands of an American administration willing to use it aggressively, can feel like a kind of coercion. For decades, that coercion remained theoretical. Under successive American administrations, the trade relationship functioned on the premise of mutual benefit. There were disputes, of course. Softwood lumber had been a source of friction for generations. Steel and aluminum had flared up and cooled down multiple times. But the institutional architecture of NAFTA and later the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement provided a framework that kept the worst impulses in check. A framework built on rules, dispute resolution mechanisms, and the quiet assumption that neighbors with deeply intertwined economies should not go to war with each other economically, even when political tempers ran hot. Donald Trump had always had a different view of that framework. His relationship with Canada had been complicated from the beginning of his first term. He had renegotiated NAFTA with considerable public fanfare, presenting the resulting USMCA as a historic victory, while Canadian trade negotiators privately believed they had preserved most of what mattered to them. There was tension with Justin Trudeau. There were tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum that caused genuine economic pain in places like Hamilton, Ontario, and Sault Ste. Marie. There were moments when the rhetorical temperature spiked so high that Canadian officials, speaking in private, began to use language about the American relationship that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. But all of that, as painful as it was, felt manageable. Temporary. Part of the Trump style rather than a fundamental restructuring of North American economic architecture. Then Trump came back. His return to the presidency in January of 2025 was accompanied by a set of policy ambitions that went well beyond the trade adjustments of his first term. The tariff framework he had in mind was broader, more systematic, and philosophically different from what had come before. It was not merely about correcting trade imbalances or extracting concessions on specific sectors. It was rooted in a deeper conviction that the post-World War II architecture of American trade policy had been a colossal mistake, that other nations, allies included, had been taking advantage of American generosity for decades, and that a decisive reckoning was overdue. Canada found itself in an unusual and deeply uncomfortable position. It was not China. It was not the European Union. It was not some distant rival whose interests could be framed in adversarial terms without political cost. Canada was, by every conventional measure, the kind of ally you were not supposed to treat this way. It had a shared defense architecture with the United States through NORAD. It was a NATO member. It was the kind of nation that American politicians had always used as an example of what a healthy alliance looked like. Treating Canada as an economic adversary required a philosophical framework that was genuinely new in American public life, and Trump seemed willing to provide it. In the early months of his second term, the tariff signals began arriving with increasing intensity. Canada would face significant tariffs on key exports unless it satisfied a series of conditions, some of which related to border security and fentanyl trafficking in ways that Canadian officials found both politically difficult and factually contested. The Canadian government pushed back publicly. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had come to power in March of 2025 after a Liberal Party leadership transition that reflected the political anxiety of the moment, was not a man inclined toward theatrical confrontation. He was, by background and temperament, a technocrat, a central banker, someone who had spent his career managing crises through careful institutional mechanisms rather than through public combat. But Carney quickly discovered that careful institutional mechanisms were not the tools the moment required. The tariffs arrived. Not all at once, but in waves, calibrated to create maximum uncertainty. 25% across many categories of Canadian goods. The fentanyl and border rationale provided a public justification, but the underlying logic, as most economists read it, was mercantilist. A belief that forcing reshoring of manufacturing, extracting concessions on dairy and digital services, and demonstrating American willingness to use economic power against allies would serve broader strategic goals. The immediate economic impact on Canada was real and measurable. Canadian business confidence fell sharply. The Canadian dollar came under pressure. Sectors that had spent decades building supply chains integrated with American manufacturing found themselves suddenly repriced out of competitive position. The auto sector, deeply intertwined across the border, faced existential uncertainty. Politicians in Ontario and Quebec, where much of Canadian manufacturing is concentrated, began receiving calls from executives who had never before engaged with political offices, asking with genuine alarm what was happening. What happened next was where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because Canada did not simply absorb the punishment and wait for it to end. There is a tendency in American political commentary to view Canada through a slightly condescending lens. A gentle neighbor. A nation that speaks softly, avoids confrontation, and ultimately accommodates American preferences because it has no real alternative. That view misunderstood something important about what the Carney government was thinking, and about the strategic logic that was quietly assembling itself in Ottawa. Canada had leverage. Not the same kind of leverage as China, which can absorb pain for years and inflict it simultaneously. But Canada had something specific and valuable: critical mineral resources that the United States needed, energy that flowed south in volumes that mattered, and a long shared border that could become either a source of friction or a point of negotiation. More importantly, Canada had international credibility. It was seen globally as a responsible, multilateral actor in a way that the United States, under its current political leadership, was increasingly not. The unexpected economic move, when it came, was not a single decision but a coordinated shift across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs of its own, targeting American goods in a fashion that was carefully designed to maximize political pain in specific American states and congressional districts. Canadian officials had done their homework. They knew which agricultural products came from swing states. They knew which manufactured goods came from districts held by Republican members of Congress who would face pressure from their own constituents. The retaliation was not symmetric, it was surgical. It was designed to create political costs for American legislators that they would then have to carry back to Washington. But the tariff retaliation was only one part of the move. The more significant dimension was what Canada began doing internationally. Carney personally invested enormous energy in the weeks following the escalation in something that could only be described as a systematic effort to reorient Canadian trade relationships away from American dependence. He traveled to Europe. He accelerated negotiations that had been moving slowly for years on expanded trade agreements with the European Union, the United Kingdom, and with Asia-Pacific partners. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Framework, which Canada was already part of through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, became the subject of new and intensified Canadian diplomatic activity. The underlying message was unmistakable. Canada was signaling that its 75% export dependence on the United States, the dependence that had always been the source of American leverage over Canada, was a vulnerability it was now actively working to reduce. Not in a month. Not even in a year. But structurally, systematically, and with the kind of commitment that comes from political leadership that has decided a fundamental reassessment is necessary. In Brussels, European Union officials who had long viewed the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement as an underperforming arrangement began receiving calls from Ottawa with a new energy. In Tokyo, in Sydney, in London, Canadian trade delegations that had operated at a relatively low level of urgency suddenly seemed to carry a different kind of weight. Because everyone understood the context. Canada was a stable, reliable, rule-following trading partner that was looking to diversify its relationships because its nearest neighbor had become unpredictable. That was a signal that other nations found compelling. There was something else Canada did that was subtler but in some ways more significant. It began quietly but publicly repositioning itself on questions of global governance and institutional architecture in ways that implicitly contrasted Canadian multilateralism with American unilateralism. Carney, speaking at international forums, talked about the importance of rules-based trade frameworks, about the value of predictability and institutional credibility, in language that required no translation for audiences in Europe or Asia. Everyone understood who was being contrasted with. This was not mere rhetoric. It was a deliberate effort to build political and reputational capital in international arenas where the United States had recently spent down its own reserves. Canada was, in effect, positioning itself as the kind of partner that other nations could trust in a world where the reliability of American commitments had become a genuine question. And then there were the critical minerals. This is the dimension of the Canada-United States relationship that receives the least attention in conventional media coverage but that carries potentially the most strategic weight. Canada sits atop some of the largest deposits of the minerals that the 21st century economy requires for its basic functioning. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, uranium. The clean energy transition, the electric vehicle revolution, the semiconductor supply chain, the defense manufacturing base, all of them depend on access to these resources. And Canada has them in quantities that make it irreplaceable in any serious American industrial strategy. The Carney government began, with deliberate public visibility, signaling that the extractive relationship through which American companies had long accessed Canadian mineral resources with relatively limited friction would require renegotiation. Not an embargo. Not a confrontational cutoff. But a clear message that the terms under which Canadian resources flowed into American supply chains were going to be revisited in light of the changed political reality. That if the United States was going to treat Canada as an economic adversary when it came to manufactured goods, Canada reserved the right to think more carefully about how it structured access to resources that American industry genuinely needed. This landed in Washington with considerable impact. American defense and technology executives who had been watching the tariff dispute with a certain detachment suddenly had a much more direct stake in the outcome. The minerals issue connected the trade dispute to questions about American technological competitiveness and national security in ways that the auto sector and dairy prices did not. It created a new constituency within the American establishment that had reasons to want the dispute resolved. Trump reacted to all of this in the way he typically reacts to unexpected pushback. With a combination of escalation and recalibration that is difficult to read in real time but that reveals its logic only in retrospect. The public rhetoric intensified. Trump spoke about Canada in terms that would have been remarkable in any previous era of the relationship. He talked about tariffs as a negotiating tool. He raised, in what many observers initially dismissed as rhetorical excess but which required serious consideration given who was speaking, the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. He framed Canadian economic policies as unfair, as predatory, as evidence that the long-standing assumption of Allied solidarity was a fiction that had cost America dearly. This created a particular kind of political dynamic inside Canada that was, in some respects, the opposite of what might have been intended. Canadian public opinion shifted in ways that were measurable and significant. Nationalism, the quiet, understated Canadian variety that had always coexisted somewhat awkwardly with the deep economic integration of the relationship, became suddenly more assertive. Canadians who had previously regarded their American neighbor with a mixture of affection and mild exasperation began to feel something that looked more like determination. The Buy Canadian sentiment that had appeared in online campaigns quickly became a genuine consumer behavior shift, documented in retail data. Travel to the United States declined sharply. American tourism dollars that had flowed north in exchange showed signs of responding in kind. Carney, who had come to power in part because the Liberal Party needed someone with the credibility to manage an economic crisis, found himself in the unusual position of leading a nation that was politically mobilized behind his trade position in a way that gave him more room to maneuver, not less. Normally, sustained economic pain from a trade war creates political pressure to settle. In this case, the nature of the confrontation, the sense that Canadian sovereignty and dignity were being tested, seemed to produce the opposite effect. Canadians appeared willing to absorb short-term economic costs in service of a longer-term principle. This complicated Trump's calculations significantly. The standard theory of his trade confrontations, derived from experience with China, Europe, and others, was that the asymmetry of pain would force concessions. The larger economy could impose greater costs than the smaller one could bear, and the smaller one would eventually come to the table. Canada was disrupting that logic not because it had equal economic power, it did not, but because it was pursuing a strategy that combined immediate retaliation, international diversification, strategic resource leverage, and domestic political solidarity in a way that reduced the effectiveness of the asymmetric pressure. Moreover, Canada had a timing advantage that was not always appreciated. The American political calendar, with its permanent midterm sensitivity, created vulnerabilities for an administration that could be exploited by a patient adversary. Canadian retaliation targeting specific agricultural and manufactured goods was not a random choice. It was a choice made with careful attention to which American economic actors had political access to the Republican Congressional Caucus and would use that access to create pressure for resolution. The dynamics inside American business and agriculture communities began to shift in ways that complicated the White House's position. Soy farmers in states that had supported Trump were watching Canadian retaliatory tariffs eat into their market. Auto manufacturers trying to manage deeply integrated cross-border supply chains were incurring costs that were measurable and attributable. The American Chamber of Commerce, which had been broadly supportive of the protectionist turn, began issuing statements that carried increasing urgency about the specific costs of the Canada confrontation. Inside the White House, the Canada file was becoming more complicated than the initial framing had suggested it would be. The public posture remained confrontational. The social media rhetoric remained at full volume. But in the more discreet channels through which actual diplomatic work happens, the conversation was beginning to shift. What made the situation genuinely novel in the history of Canadian-American relations was that it was unfolding in the context of a broader global realignment that neither country had fully anticipated when the dispute began. China's economic challenges, the restructuring of European defense commitments, the instability of global supply chains following the pandemic, the rapid acceleration of the artificial intelligence and clean energy transitions. All of these forces were reshaping the strategic context in which the bilateral relationship existed. Canada, for the first time in a very long time, found itself being courted. Not just by European trading partners but by nations across the Asia-Pacific, by international financial institutions looking for stable policy environments, by the global business community looking for predictable regulatory frameworks in a world where predictability had become scarce. Canadian credibility, which had always been real but had perhaps been taken for granted, was suddenly a marketable asset in a way it had not been before. This was not lost on Canadian officials. There is something almost paradoxical about the way the trade confrontation unfolded. Trump's pressure, which was intended to extract concessions and demonstrate Canadian vulnerability, had instead catalyzed a Canadian strategic awakening that was beginning to produce concrete results. The diversification of trade relationships that Canadian governments had talked about for decades without urgency had suddenly acquired urgency. The development of critical mineral supply chains that American policy experts had occasionally noted as an opportunity was now moving toward implementation with Canadian government support and international partner interest. None of this resolved the immediate economic pain. The tariffs remained in place through much of 2025, and their costs were real. Canadian business investment decisions were affected. Some manufacturing activities that had been borderline economically viable in the new tariff environment faced genuine pressure. The automobile sector continued to navigate extraordinary uncertainty. The immediate human cost of the trade dispute, measured in delayed investments, restructured supply chains, and the anxiety of workers in exposed industries, was not trivial. But the strategic trajectory had shifted in a way that was significant. The back-channel conversations that began to emerge as 2025 progressed suggested that both sides were looking for a path to de-escalation that would allow each to claim an acceptable outcome. Trump administration officials, according to accounts from people familiar with the discussions, were increasingly focused on specific, winnable concessions that could be framed publicly as victories. The broader goal of forcing Canada into permanent economic subordination through tariff pressure seemed to be giving way to a search for a negotiated resolution with identifiable wins on both sides. Canada's position was that any resolution had to genuinely address the underlying instability of the relationship, not just pause the current confrontation. Carney and his trade team were not looking for a return to the status quo ante. They had spent months building alternative economic relationships, recalibrating their strategic dependence on the American market, and developing a domestic political narrative about Canadian strength and resilience that could not simply be abandoned in exchange for a return to the old dependence. The diversification strategy had taken on a life of its own. It had constituencies, institutional momentum, and a political logic that went beyond the immediate tariff dispute. There is something deeply revealing about what this entire episode exposes, not just about the Canada-United States relationship, but about the nature of power in the contemporary world. The assumption that drives aggressive unilateral trade policy is fundamentally about the asymmetry of size. Big economies can compel small ones. Large markets can dictate terms to smaller ones. And there is truth in that assumption as far as it goes. But it misses something important about the way power actually works in a deeply interconnected world. The interconnection itself creates vulnerability for the larger party as well as the smaller one. The United States needed Canadian energy, Canadian minerals, Canadian manufacturing capacity, and Canadian political cooperation on a range of security and governance issues. Treating Canada as a subordinate rather than an ally carried costs that were real even if they were not always visible in the immediate economic data. It also misses something about political will. The story of international economic coercion is not simply the story of who has the largest economy. It is also the story of who is willing to absorb pain in service of a principle, who has the domestic political solidarity to sustain a position under pressure, and who has the strategic patience to build alternatives rather than simply waiting for relief. On all three of those dimensions, the Carney government demonstrated more than Washington had expected. What you are watching, if you pull back far enough to see the full frame, is not just a trade dispute between two neighboring countries. It is a test case for something larger. A test of whether the post-World War II architecture of international cooperation, the web of treaties, agreements, and shared institutions that the United States itself built and led for 7 decades, can survive a period of American ambivalence about its own creation. Canada chose, in this moment, to defend that architecture rather than accommodate its erosion. Not out of sentimentality, but out of strategic self-interest and a genuine belief that rules-based international order serves Canadian interests better than a world organized purely around bilateral power relationships. Whether that position succeeds in any final sense depends on dynamics that are still unfolding. Trade disputes at this scale rarely resolve cleanly. They leave residue. They reshape business decisions that do not simply reverse when political temperatures drop. They alter the psychology of the relationship in ways that persist long after the specific tariff schedules are modified. Canadian businesses that spent 2025 scrambling to find alternative markets do not simply abandon those markets when American access is restored. European trading partners that invested in expanded relationships with Canada do not simply step back when the urgency recedes. The diversification, in other words, may prove more durable than the confrontation that prompted it. And that is perhaps the deepest consequence of Canada's unexpected economic move. Trump reacted to the move with his characteristic combination of public aggression and private calculation. He escalated rhetorically even as his team worked toward resolution through quieter channels. He framed Canada's response as confirmation of his original critique, as evidence that allies had always been taking advantage, while simultaneously acknowledging, through the willingness to negotiate, that the Canadian position had more substance than he had initially credited. The broader question that this episode raises, and that will be debated long after the specific tariffs are resolved, is what it means for the United States to treat its closest economic partner as an adversary. The answer is not merely economic. It is geopolitical. It is about the kind of world America is trying to build or maintain. A world organized around American power and American rules is very different from a world organized around shared rules that the United States helps to enforce but does not unilaterally dictate. Canada's choice to resist, to diversify, to build alternative relationships, and to do so with a coherence and effectiveness that surprised many observers, was in part a statement about which kind of world Canada believed was worth defending. That statement has echoes in Brussels, in Tokyo, in Canberra, in London. Other allies are watching the Canada-United States confrontation and drawing their own conclusions about American reliability, about the durability of existing institutional frameworks, and about the wisdom of maintaining the deep dependencies on American market access and American political goodwill that post-war prosperity was built on. The unexpected economic move that Canada made was not ultimately just about tariffs. It was about something more fundamental. It was about a middle power deciding, in a moment of clarity forced on it by external pressure, what kind of country it wanted to be and what kind of international order it believed in. And it was about the limits of economic coercion as a tool of foreign policy when the target is not merely calculating its options but is genuinely committed to a principle. History does not often offer moments this clarifying. Usually the ground shifts slowly beneath the surface, and the changes become visible only in retrospect, when the decisions that shaped them are long since made. This was different. This happened in public, in real time, with consequences that are still compounding. Power, in the end, is never quite what it appears to be from the outside. It is not simply a function of economic size or military capability or the volume of a leader's rhetoric. It is also a function of credibility, of the willingness to absorb cost, of the quality of the relationships you have built over time, and of the strategic clarity you bring to moments of genuine pressure. Canada, in its confrontation with the most powerful nation in the world, demonstrated more of those qualities than most observers had expected. And that, perhaps more than any specific tariff schedule or trade agreement, is what this story is really about. The numbers will eventually settle. The agreements will be renegotiated, the tariffs adjusted, the statements carefully worded to give both sides something they can call a win. That is how these things always end. Not with a dramatic resolution but with a gradual, unglamorous return to something that resembles normalcy, carrying within it all the changes that the confrontation produced. But something will have shifted. Permanently, quietly, in the way that the most significant historical changes always do. Canada will be a different country in its relationship with the United States than it was before this began. Not dramatically different. Not unrecognizably different. But the confidence that comes from having been tested and not broken, the international relationships built in the urgency of the moment, the diversification strategy that turned from aspiration to reality, and the domestic political awakening that accompanied the confrontation, all of these will persist. And the United States will have learned something too. That its economic relationships are not unconditional. That allies have options even when those options are expensive to exercise. That the credibility of an alliance is not a fixed asset that can be drawn down indefinitely without consequence. That power, exercised without regard for the interests and dignity of those subject to it, tends to generate the very resistance it was meant to suppress. This is the oldest story in international relations, told once again in the language of the 21st century. And it is not finished yet.